In typical Grand Moff Tony fashion, changing plans this week makes you wonder why I even bother doing the next week segments on the end of videos. Hello there, welcome back to the channel. I am Grand Moff Tony. Yes, the Bad Batch Season 3 review has been pushed out to next week since we haven't had the time this week to sit down and properly rewatch the series, decide what our thoughts and feelings are on the different parts of it, and actually find the time to sit down and record the bloody review in the first place. So we'll be doing that next week. So this week, in a kind of a impromptu last-minute decision, we're going to be doing a continuation of a video series I started recently where I take to Quora and answer some of the internet's biggest Star Wars questions. I actually set up an official Grand Moff Tony Quora profile, so if you want to jump in and ask a question, you absolutely can, and hey, it might end up on this series. Among the strange and the weird and the not very interesting, I found a few gems of actually really good questions that I really enjoyed answering. So those are the questions I'm going to be sharing with you today. I'm going to grab a handful of them, sit here, give you the answers, and yeah, we'll go from there. Up first, if the Jedi Council didn't trust Anakin, why the hell did they approve his appointment in the first place? This was kind of a strange move for the Jedi Council, and I think it has more to do with them exploring their suspicions surrounding Palpatine than it does to kind of showing a growth of trust in Anakin. Everybody on the Council expresses concern with Palpatine's request to have a personal representative on the Jedi Council. And the fact that it's Anakin, someone that they don't really trust in the first place, just makes it even worse. But as Obi-Wan points out in the following scene, it is 100% to do with giving the Council a direct line to keep an eye on the Chancellor. What they're essentially doing here is they are playing Anakin's loyalty to the Jedi Council against his loyalty to the Chancellor, because in the sunny everything works out as we wanted to version of events, Anakin chooses his loyalty to the Council over his loyalty to Palpatine and turns him over, which is almost what happens. As we know, Anakin's faith in the Jedi Council and his loyalty to the Jedi Order had already been irrevocably shaken at this point. Look at several events in the Clone Wars, like Obi-Wan's undercover mission where he faked his death and nobody told Anakin, or their whole treatment surrounding the end of Ahsoka's time in the Jedi Order. These events didn't just make Anakin frustrated with the Jedi Order, and we see him expressing a desire that he too could walk away to Ahsoka, but really it causes him to square most of the blame on the Jedi Council themselves. When it came down to his loyalty to the Council going up against his loyalty to Palpatine, well, we all know which one ended up winning out in the end, and it wasn't Palpatine that ended up with his hand cut off, getting launched out of a window. You have to look at it from Anakin's perspective. This is someone who they're weighing up the balance between an order that has treated him like an outsider since day one, used him as a weapon and a propaganda machine all through the Clone Wars, going up against someone who, forwardly at least, has been nothing but a friend, mentor, and personal guide to Anakin. It was obvious which one was going to win out. So why did the Council approve it in the first place? Well, it was to suit their own ends. It just backfired in the worst way possible. Up next, what would the Jedi Council have done with Count Dooku had they captured him aboard the Invisible Hand rather than Anakin executing him? And this definitely would have been awkward for a certain secret Sith Lord's grand plan. Unfortunately for the Jedi, it's not illegal to be a Sith Lord. In fact, most people in the galaxy don't even know who the Sith are. Most people call active Sith Lords Jedi with red lightsabers. We see that all through the Clone Wars. But it's not illegal in any sense of the word to be a Sith. So in the sense of his position as a Sith Lord, Count Dooku is just a high-profile person of an alternate faith. It would be kind of like a Christian arresting a Buddhist on the grounds that he is a Buddhist. As I say, most of the galaxy doesn't know about the Sith, they've been gone for a long time. It would be a tough sell. Now, what about his position as leader of the Confederacy? Could he be charged with treason against the Galactic Republic? Well, actually, no. This is taking some information from Star Wars Legends that hasn't really been cemented into canon, but since it hasn't been contradicted, I consider it a kind of loose canon. But there are actually no articles of secession in the Republic Constitution. Basically, To leave the Republic, all you have to do is just announce that you're leaving the Republic. I believe the Confederacy required you to publicly denounce the Republic as a means of, gaining access to joining the CIS. But as far as leaving the Republic, there's no legal ramifications for just walking away. It's actually kind of a grey area in the movies, and they kind of go into it a little bit in the Clone Wars. The movies kind of present it that the Clone Wars starts as a retaliatory act against these planets leaving the Republic, and that simply isn't true. The Clone Wars was started by the Confederacy in retaliation for the Jedi interrupting what was a fair and legal execution on the planet Geonosis. It just happened to include 3 main characters. However, while they wouldn't be able to charge Dooku with being a Sith or being the leader of the Confederacy, because there's just no legal grounds for any of that, he does commit a number of serious war crimes over the course of the Clone Wars, mostly under the guidance of Darth Sidious. But remember, the Republic and the Jedi, they only vaguely know about Sidious when the Clone Wars are going on. Torturing prisoners, the murder of Silman, the former Chancellor's aide, engaging in slavery and trying to restart the slave trade, not to mention the massive amounts of wealth he hoards from his own planet, which they kind of went into in the Bad Batch. The list just keeps coming of bad stuff that Dooku did during the Clone Wars that kind of wear away at his immaculate presentation as just a freedom fighter who wants to end corruption in the Republic. And it would be charges for these war crimes that I imagine the Council or the Republic would bring against Dooku in the event that he was captured, assuming that Darth Sidious didn't just, pull some strings and get him released, the way he did when Grievous was captured on Naboo. We're kind of sticking with a Clone Wars theme here with why did nobody else use a droid army after the end of the Clone Wars? And the biggest reason for this is basically how badly they performed during the Clone Wars. On their worst day, the Confederacy outnumbered the Republic clones by 100 to 1. And yet they are constantly outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and defeated again and again and again by the clone troopers. This really damages the public perception of a droid army's efficiency. Now, we mustn't hold it against them entirely. The droid armies were a puppet of far more grand and sinister designs, so it's not really their fault they didn't have a chance. If Sidious needed the droids to lose a certain day, they would lose, and if he needed them to win, on those days, they would win. So take their catastrophic win-loss record and add it to a growing sense of anti-droid sentiment spreading throughout the galaxy, and not only would an up-and-coming warlord not want to use a droid army for efficiency reasons, but they also wouldn't want to use them just because of how badly droids were disliked by the end of the Clone Wars. It should be noted that obviously, after the Clone Wars ended, there were instances of droids being used in a military capacity, but it was usually in support of other troops. The Bedlam Raiders from Jedi Survivor, for instance, they use a force of reprogrammed battle droids from a crashed Confederacy ship, and they use them to support their own troops. Darth Vader and Dr. Aphra work on building a droid army to go up against Palpatine in the comics. And of course, Moff Gideon makes use of a squadron of Dark Troopers to support his own Imperial Remnant forces. So it's not that droids just aren't being used at all anymore, it's just they're not being relied upon in their entirety to make up an entire military force. They're just being used in a support position. How is it that Count Dooku is able to use the Force to speed himself up for his duel against Yoda, and why doesn't he use this power to utterly wreck Anakin and Obi-Wan? Important thing to know about Count Dooku is he is the single greatest lightsaber duelist in the galaxy. That's not just to do with his use of Form 2, or the fact that he makes use of a curved lightsaber hilt, which is specifically designed to be superior in saber combat. It has more to do with the fact that Dooku studies his opponents and alters his style to best counteract the strengths and weaknesses of his opponent. Take, for instance, his last duel on the Invisible Hand. Dooku knows that Anakin is an incredibly aggressive, over-the-top, offensive lightsaber duelist, and he knows that Obi-Wan is incredibly defensive. So what does he do? He matches their style. He uses defensive strafes and parries against Kenobi, which lure Kenobi out of his defensive stance and into attacking, which he's less comfortable doing, and he focuses all of his attacks on Anakin to force him onto the defensive. And this of course works like a charm until Anakin taps into the dark side and cuts off his hands. Now, Dooku trained under Yoda. Yoda was Dooku's master, and they sparred on a number of occasions, from duels that ranged from, like, friendly little sparring matches all the way up to really aggressive, we're having a proper argument and we're having it through a lightsaber fight. Proper duels. The two of them butted heads over Dooku's obsession with lightsaber dueling for a very, very long time. This was a time of peace, after all, and the need for saber training and going up against Sith Lords who also had lightsabers was, at the time, not necessary, as far as the Council was concerned. Not the first time they've been wrong. Dooku dueled Yoda regularly, so he would have been intimately familiar with his old master's fighting style. The film makes it look like Yoda's attack comes completely out of nowhere, but as you can see, Dooku immediately jumps in and is countering Yoda's speed, countering his form. He's on the defensive for the entire duel, let's not kid ourselves here, but it's not like it was a surprise to him, it was a surprise to us. And just looking at Dooku's moves in this duel, you can see he's using the Force to speed himself up to match his master's incredibly over-the-top attacks. So that's how he would have known. I mean, it's got nothing to do with him being the best duelist in the galaxy, really. It just has more to do with that. This is the guy who trained him. It would be like if Obi-Wan were fighting Qui-Gon. He would probably know how his master fought. So then why doesn't Dooku use this power to utterly wreck Obi-Wan and Anakin in the duel beforehand? This is something that comes up a lot when power creep sort of happens over the course of a movie series. You see new abilities being revealed that these people supposedly knew how to do all along, and you say, well, why didn't he do that back there? I don't know how often the little speed run from Phantom Menace comes up. Like, why did that never happen again? Well, simply put, it's a combination of arrogance and energy conservation on Dooku's part. Drawing on the Force is incredibly tiring. You see this represented best in video games, where you can't just keep spamming your favourite Force attack, because most of these games have a Force meter that goes down. And while it probably doesn't work one-to-one that way in the actual universe itself, it does kind of let you know that there is an element of stamina, of exhaustion, that you can reach while using these powers. In The Last Jedi, it's Luke's constant use of Force projection that causes him to actually die. So most people can only draw on the Force for a certain amount of time before exhausting themselves. And add to this, Dooku knows he can take Kenobi and Skywalker. He has that signature look of superiority. He knows he can take these two kids. So what does he do? He conserves his energy by simply defeating them with his superior saber skills. First he sidelines Anakin, then he sidelines Obi-Wan, and then he comes back again and sidelines Anakin again. And at that point you can almost see that he is getting a little tired. I've always thought that was a combination of, okay, that took a little bit more energy than I thought it would, mixed with just a dash of disappointment that it wasn't more of a challenge, or lamenting the fact that he had to fight them in the first place, given his relationship to Qui-Gon. So in short, he doesn't use this incredibly powerful ability against inferior foes like Anakin and Obi-Wan, because besides the fact that he knows they're inferior, it also would have been a tremendous waste of his energy. And that would have meant that when Yoda came in, he maybe wouldn't have had enough energy left to call on the Force to properly duel his master. Think about it in terms of, like, Galaxy of Heroes, when you're playing Grand Arena and you go in against a team that you know you can beat, but you use, like, a Galactic Legend team to utterly wipe them out. Well, now that Galactic Legend team is gone, and oh, the back territory has opened up, and there's another Galactic Legend on defense, and now you can't take it out. Think of it like that. That's kind of how I think about it. And just because I think I answered this question half a dozen times, maybe more this month, here's your one out-of-the-box filmmaking question for the week. Why did Disney choose to not use the existing expanded universe when they revived Star Wars? Let's kick things off with something that I think is very, very important to point out. It's very, very important to distinguish that the EU itself was never canon. These were stories that were written by people that told a potential continuation for what might have happened after the films, or what might have come before them. Nobody was allowed to touch the Clone Wars, nobody was allowed to really touch the origins of Darth Vader, because Lucas knew he was going back to do that. And speaking of Lucas, it's obvious from his notes that he had no plans of following the EU timeline either. Looking at his ideas for his potential sequel trilogy, it's obvious that he's not taking the EU events into consideration at all. Now, ideas were certainly cherry-picked from the expanded universe, like the plans to include Darth Revan in the Mortis arc of the Clone Wars, and I believe there was even plans to include the Yuzang Vong as well that ended up not going anywhere. So there are certainly ideas that have been taken from the EU and brought into canon, but as far as the timeline itself goes, it was never really much more than just high-budget fanfiction. So let's say that we take the timeline of events that's told by the book and we keep it moving into a new alternate universe revised sequel timeline. This idea presents us with two paths that these movies could take: to adapt an existing story or to try to write a new one in and around what has already been written. Now, as much as I would like to think that I would have loved to go to the cinema in 2015 and see Star Wars Episode 7 Heir to the Empire, I've always kind of thought that it would be an unlikely thing for a studio to do, to retell an existing story after a 10-year hiatus from Star Wars. This is the first live-action Star Wars movie in 10 years, and we're gonna retell an existing story. I don't think it would have gone that way. It may well have gotten bums in seats in 2015 for Episode 7, but choosing to do a one-to-one adaptation of an existing story really limits the creative freedom of the people making the movies. And in terms of the audience, it leaves the audience knowing exactly what's going to happen in Episodes 8 and 9 without even showing up to them. That's not what filmmakers want. That's not what a studio wants. It's not what anyone who's investing millions and millions of dollars into a movie franchise wants. They don't want you to know the ending. And look at the general trend of film adaptations of existing content. How rarely is it one-to-one? Like, it's so rare that they just take the book and make the movie the exact same way. Everyone wants to put their spin on it. Everyone wants to focus on the things that they find interesting. They want to put a highlight on the characters they find interesting. It's a very, very creative process, and that's why you hear so much about creators like Alan Moore or Stephen King really hating the adaptations of their work. You know, filmmakers are creators in their own rights. They want to tell their own stories. They don't want to get locked into what's already been written. And that kind of presents two branch options on this one path. The one part being, we get a one-to-one adaptation and we all know how it ends because we've all already read it, or we have an adaptation that plays fast and loose with the existing content, and that could probably spark even more division. So that leads us into option B, and that is telling a new story but making it work within the confines of the established EU. Now, the people have been writing these books since the first film. Like, there are tons and tons and tons of these books, and frankly, every single corner of the timeline is pretty much filled in. I used to have a collection of magazines that had the entire expanded universe timeline in it. If we have to take every single word that's been written as set in stone canon, it leaves so little opportunity for expansion and exploration of new ideas. And every step of the way, the writers would have to cross-check themselves by double-checking where characters are supposed to be at that point in the timeline. Who's still alive? Who's dead? What events have happened? What events haven't happened? This is part of the reason why, according to Dave Filoni, George Lucas said continuity is for wimps. If there's something that's stopping you from telling your story, ignore it and tell your story anyway. And I definitely feel like the postmodern obsession with the idea of canon, of organizing every single event that happens and trying to find a way to make it all work in the same universe, thanks very much, Marvel, is incredibly overrated. It's incredibly overrated. I mean, nobody has sat down and done a canon timeline of Brothers Grimm fairy tales, right? Nobody really cares where Cinderella happens in the timeline in relation to where Hansel and Gretel happen. And I feel like the same can be said of Star Wars. Like, these are supposed to be campfire stories. And this kind of plays into another question that I answered this week that I didn't have a long enough answer for, which was the exact opposite. Why do people still care about the EU if it's not canon anymore? And it's because of this. It's because these are supposed to be stories. They're just stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, and sometimes one series of events happen, and sometimes the other series of events happen. It depends on who's telling the story and what's going on. So in short, why didn't they follow the existing timeline? Well, it would have given them really two very limiting options of what stories to tell. They could have retold the same story and everyone would have known how it ended because we've already read it, or they could have tried to fit it around what was already happening and there wasn't really room in the timeline for that. So there you have it. Those were a couple of the internet's most interesting Star Wars questions that I answered this week on Quora. Obviously the profile is up and live on there, so if you have a burning question about Star Wars that you want me to answer, jump in there. I mean, I've got quite a long list of requests I've already been sent, but I will get to them all in good time. And hey, why not ask me down in the comments a burning Star Wars question that you've always wanted answered? It can be lore related, I suppose it can be filmmaking related if you like. I don't know a ton about filmmaking and I know nothing about the filmmaking process besides what I've learned from documentaries on 2-disc DVD box sets. But I will give it my absolute best shot. As I said, hopefully the Bad Batch Season 3 review will be completed this week and we can get that out to you next Friday. Otherwise, I'm going to have to think of another off-the-cuff video to do at the last minute. In the meantime, however, I've been Grand Moff Tony. Those were some more of the internet's biggest Star Wars questions. You may subscribe when ready. Quora is so hard to say. Who came up with that? What does it even mean? What is that? Council? A Buddha? Arresting a Buddha? Superior saber skills.